Just like in painting, architecture, music, writers, poets, playwrights during the 17th and 18th centuries also express their concerns, their philosophical views, their worries, their religious or mundane beliefs in the style that would characterize most of the literature at that time. Here we have Pierre Corneille. Pierre Corneille, a French tragedian, a playwright who took many classical themes to represent them in the French court. Medea, Andromeda, Oedipus, these names probably ring a bell because they all refer to classic tragedy, to Aeschylus, to Euripides. Why in France in the 17th century? Because, again, of the continuity of the presence of the classical world, but with a religious twist. When Corneille decided to write a play called Le Cid, not based on classical characters, but on the hero of the Spanish Reconquista or counter-conquest against the Moors, a hero who had in his own right a wonderful epic poem called precisely Le Cid, or the Lord. Well, he fell in disgrace. Cardinal Richelieu decided not to support him anymore, but he still for 40 more years continued to be a very popular playwright all over France, together with another extraordinary playwright, Racine. So Racine, Corneille, and this other guy, the comedian, Molière. Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, who used the pen name of Molière, was a very famous satirist. He made fun, he mocked the social ways of life, the court, specific individuals. Misanthrope, he who hates everybody, the school for wives, the imaginary invalid. These are some of his most famous plays. The Bourgeois Gentleman, extraordinary for entertainment, but also for denouncing the excesses of the court and of society in general. In England, another wonderful Baroque poet, John Milton, author of Paradise Lost. And he appears here in an engraving depicting him at the age of 21, when he was still very young. The definitive version of Paradise Lost, his famous poem, is from 1674. Paradise Lost, as we most know, is the story of the fall of man because of the temptation that Satan inflicted into Eve and that led to the original sin. The original sin was the product of Satan's opposition to God. He wanted to spoil God's creation, so he decided to tempt Adam and Eve, which consequentially derived in the expulsion of the Garden of Eden. So this beautiful epic poem, Paradise Lost, as I mentioned, published in its definitive form of 12 chants in 1674, is basically a religious argument to justify the ways of God to men. We need to accept the will of God. We're still in the Baroque frame of ideas, together with Luis de Góngora and Francisco de Quevedo, contemporaries of Miguel de Cervantes. Cervantes, Góngora, and Quevedo. Although Cervantes is slightly earlier, one of his late novels, the works of Persiles and Sigismund, that could be considered Baroque. In the case of Góngora and Quevedo, Góngora is basically a poet. Quevedo is a poet, but also a novelist. They represent the splendor of Spanish literature at the moment in which Spain was living what is called its golden age. Even today, or until very recently, Góngora, Luis de Góngora y Argote, his complete name, born in 1561, died in 1627, as you see in the transit between the 16th and the 17th century, founded what is considered the most important form of poetry at that time. Culteranismo or culturalism is a branch of the Baroque that created many fans, many followers, but also a lot of opposition, particularly later in the late 17th century and during the 18th century. He was considered too obscure, unnecessarily complicated. However, in the 20th century, Góngora was vindicated. He came back to light and considered as one of the inspirers of many of the avant-garde and modernist forms of literary writing.